What exactly is organ donations?
That's a very broad question. Well, basically, I work for what's called an organ procurement organization, the Center for Donation and Transplant.
Right.
And our mission is to facilitate the donation of organs and tissues for transplantation. So organs would include such organs as heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, pancreas, and small intestine. And people are also able to donate tissues such as bones, skin, heart valves, cartilage, connective tissues, skin, and you know, obviously the intent and the outcome of being able to donate both organs and tissues is to help save and enhance the lives of others who are in desperate need of a transplant.
If one wants to be an organ recipient, what are the requirements?
Well, it's you know, it's a long process. I shouldn't say long, but it's an involved process to get listed for a transplant. Right now, we've got about 110,000 people in the United States waiting for a life-saving organ transplant. Every year, we have roughly about 27,000 to 28,000 organ transplants that occur on a national level. So if you look at the disparity between those two numbers, there's 110,000 people waiting, and there's just under 30,000 people who receive them every year. And you know, the gap between those two keeps rising. When I started at CDT, which was back in 2003, I think there was about 83,000 patients on the list. And a very unfortunate outcome of that gap is that we lose an average of 17 people every day because there's just not enough organs available for transplant. You know, and I think you know, the real sadness in that fact is that we are not looking for a cure for these patients. We know what's going to save their lives, an organ transplant. The concern is that there is just not enough organs available for transplant. So if someone wanted to or needed an organ transplant, basically the way the process works is that if a person was having kidney troubles and had a serious kidney disease, they would be seen by a nephrologist, and that's a kidney specialist. And if it reached the point in that patient's treatment that they required a transplant, that nephrologist would refer the patient to a transplant program that did kidney transplants. So the patient would then be seen by the transplant program and be evaluated for potentially being listed for a transplant. And that evaluation is very complex. It's both physical evaluations and tests to ensure that the patient is a viable candidate for transplantation, but also psychological tests to make sure that they are able to take care of that gift of life should they receive it. So, for example, being a recipient, you have to take a lot of medication that's called immunosuppressants to ensure that your transplanted organ is not rejected by your body. So before anybody gets on the list, the transplant program wants to make sure that they are able to take care of that gift after they receive it. Are they able to keep up with the medication? Are they living a lifestyle that's conducive to having a healthy transplant? Once that testing is done, then the patient would be put on the list.
What do you mean by living a lifestyle that is conducive to a transplant?
Well, you know, some of the questions that we get asked that are I think, you know, good ethical questions are that what happens if somebody has led a lifestyle or made lifestyle decisions that led to the need for a transplant? So, for example, somebody who was an alcoholic or a heavy drinker in the past.
Larry Hageman got a transplant, and there was some criticism of that.
Right, because he led a lifestyle that led to the need for a liver transplant. Right. But before somebody is able to be listed, they would need to be able to prove to the transplant program that they are no longer participating in those kind of activities that you know, that led to the need for the transplant. So if you have somebody that was an alcoholic in the past but has since you know, changed their lifestyle and is no longer drinking, then you know, the program the transplant center would be evaluating to make sure that that lifestyle that they're leading is a healthy one and wouldn't require or wouldn't lead to the organ getting rejected or you know, the organ being compromised by a person's lifestyle.
By innuendo, you also seem to indicate that if someone needed an organ transplant, but they were not healthy enough to support the fact that there would be the rejection and the fact that there would be so much medication to take that that might impact your decisions as well?
Well, sometimes people aren't healthy enough to receive a transplant at that time. You know, they may be undergoing other complicating factors that wouldn't make them a candidate for the surgery. I mean, the surgery itself, anytime anyone undergoes surgery, you know, you're taking a risk. And if it's a severely sick person and the surgery itself might not be something they survive, they probably wouldn't be listed at that time. You know, my organization is not involved in the listing of transplant candidates. We're solely involved in the recovery and allocations of organs for transplant. So I can't speak to you as an expert in the listing of patients for transplant, but those are the general guidelines and the kind of process that someone would have to walk through in order to be listed.
New York State is a first-person consent state. What exactly does that mean?
It means that, so New York State has what we call a donor registry. It's the Donate Life New York State Registry. And, you know, I think most people know about it through the DMV. So if you go to the DMV and you check that you want to be a donor, that information is then stored in a confidential database that's maintained by the Department of Health. You know, if there's somebody that dies in a way that allows for the potential of donation, my colleagues can check that database to see if they designated themselves a donor. And if they did make that decision and they are on the registry, it means that we are required by law to honor that patient's decision. So if you know, a patient has designated him or herself a donor and their only next of kin is a second cousin in Oklahoma, that second cousin in Oklahoma can't overturn that person's stated desire to be a donor.
Okay, but also too, I understand, like if I were being a donor, my wife Kathy could not overturn that either.
Your next of kin could not overturn your wishes.
Now,
and it's the same, you know, it follows the same path as other healthcare decisions, where if, you know, you or I fill out a healthcare proxy and we are very explicit about what kind of treatment we want to receive in what circumstances, no one in our lives could come in and attempt to override that. And, you know, say you don't want a feeding tube, you know, and you've made that wish made. Your wife or my husband or whomever can't come in and force that upon us if that wasn't our desire. It's all about honoring what an individual's decision is about their health care, and that's everything from, you know, what they want to have happen when they're receiving, say, intensive care treatment to what their end-of-life decisions are.
Now, you were indicating to me that the usual donors are like people that have been in sudden auto accidents, brain death, aneurysms, or maybe like we had in Albany recently, a shooting death where someone was just shot and remained alive, brain dead. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure, but I want to actually step back a second because you sort of just said a contradiction in terms. You said they stayed alive while brain dead. And I think that's important to note that you know, all of those circumstances that you mentioned, an aneurysm, you know, a stroke, a traumatic head injury as a result of a car accident may lead to brain death. And in those circumstances, it's very important to note that brain death is death. It's a legal, moral, clinical definition of death. So it's not being in a coma, and it's not, you know, very sadly, it's never going to be an opportunity where a patient has a chance to get better. You know, it's a legal definition of death, and the opportunity to donate after brain death is it's a viable option because the patients are connected to a ventilator, which is artificially sustaining their body until the family makes the decision as to whether or not they want to donate, if the patient hasn't already made that decision via a registry. So you know, I think it's very important for people to kind of understand the difference between what brain death might be versus a very serious head injury versus being in a comatose state. But you know, all of those circumstances, brain death happens very, very infrequently, which is part of the reason why there are so many people waiting for a transplant, because the opportunity for people to donate organs is small. About 1% to 3% of all deaths that occur in a hospital every year are brain deaths. The vast majority of patients that die in a hospital will suffer from cardiac death, about 97 to 99%. So when you're talking about potential organ donors, you know, patients that die in a way that allow for the potential of organ donation, it's a very small pool. You know, of that small pool, you know, on any given day, month, or year, I would say the average percentage of people who donate can change from like 50 to 75%. So, we're burying the rest of those organs. So when the families decline, or if the patients have indicated they don't want to be a donor. So, one of our goal as an organ procurement organization is to kind of lay information out for people so that they're able to make that informed decision beforehand, so that when that opportunity does arise from that small pool of people who can potentially donate, families are able to make an informed decision if the patients haven't made one for themselves beforehand.
One thing, and I know you and I have talked about this before, when my wife's mom died, they decided she couldn't get any better, and they disconnected, what was keeping her alive. I'm very glad I never had to make that decision with my parents, because I don't think I could do that. And even though, as you said, they're brain dead, you're still, when you disconnect that, you're killing your mommy, you're killing your daddy, or you're killing someone you love. And that has to be a very difficult decision for someone.
Well, I think, you're talking about end-of-life treatment where a family has decided they want to withdraw care. And in those circumstances, that happens, sadly every day in hospitals. And the vast majority of those patients aren't brain dead. Many of them have suffered no brain injury whatsoever.
Right.
You may have a patient who has a very advanced lung disease who's not going to survive that disease, and the family decides to withdraw care. So withdrawals of care you're right, they're extremely difficult for a family. They are, very sad circumstances, but they are an everyday occurrence, and most of those patients are not patients who are brain dead. When a patient suffers from brain death, the family actually does not have to decide to withdraw care because the patient has died. The patient's ventilator would be turned off regardless of whether or not they chose to donate, because a hospital is not going to keep a deceased body on a ventilator. So, when a patient becomes brain dead, the family really has two decisions. And one decision would be, if the patient's a viable candidate for donation, do they want the patient to be an organ donor? The second decision would just be, or I should actually step back, they decide whether or not the patient wants to be a donor, yes or no. And if yes, then the process of organ donation would begin. If no, the patient's ventilator is going to be disconnected, and the family proceeds with whatever funeral arrangements and burial arrangements that they would have. So it's not making a decision as to whether or not they want to continue care or go the route of organ donation. At the point that the family is being asked to consider donation, the patient has already died. So it's really a decision of whether or not they want the patient to be a donor, or they want the patient not to donate, and they would follow kind of that path of what the next steps would be for a deceased person.
We only have a few moments left, and I want to be sure we cover this. In conversations that we had the other day, you indicated that New York State seems to make it more difficult, or make it rather cumbersome, to become an organ donor. Would you talk about that a little bit?
It hasn't been, it hasn't been the perfect process. Certainly, New York State is leaps and bounds ahead of some other states in terms of their registry. Right now, if somebody does not sign up at the DMV, they do have the opportunity to go to the Department of Health and website and fill out fields online. But as of right now, and this will be changing, but as of today, you still need an actual written signature to ensure that you're in the registry. So I could go and fill out these fields, but then I have to print out the piece of paper, sign the piece of paper, and mail it in. And as we know, in today's era of doing everything online or on your smartphone, a lot of people aren't going to take that second step and print something out, physically sign it, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it to the Department of Health. The Department of Health and the DMV has been working very collaboratively with my organization and the other organ procurement organizations in New York State to develop a portal for electronic signatures, and that will be coming soon, which I would hope would help increase the percentage of New Yorkers who are on the registry, because there are very few, it's a small percentage of New Yorkers who are on our registry as compared to other states.